Welcome, everyone, to Journeys to the Books of the Prophets. We are continuing with the second book of Kings. We begin on chapter 9. And tonight we're going to be going, hopefully, through chapter 14. Before we begin, I want to give a slight introduction so we know how we're going to go about this. As you know, there are certain evenings where we get through one chapter and we discuss in great detail whatever the event or the story of that chapter. This part of the book of Kings, I must say, is quite gory, not easy to understand. One king after another. Each one is being killed by either a relative or servants. Some of them are intermarrying between the northern and the southern kingdom. The names start to get very similar, very, very difficult to keep track of the lineage of the kings of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And so, since the purpose of our learning here is to try to get the essence of what is happening in the book of Kings, tonight we're going to go through 4 or 5 chapters, just because, like I said, there's a lot of details, but it's, like I said, it's one gory scene after another. I'll tell you somewhat of it's not an amusing story, but it will put everything into perspective. I can't remember how many years ago. I'm just going to throw out a number. Around 10 years ago, my wife and I went on a kosher tour of England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. It was a fantastic, fantastic trip. When we were in Scotland, so the tour guide that we had, so he knew Scottish history, he knew English history, Irish history, and so he was constantly telling stories as we're going from place to place of different things that happened there, different kings who ruled, everything. So one particular day, he was telling about different, called infighting within Scottish aristocracy. And everyone was killing everyone else. It was kind of a mess. And at one point, I remember someone on the bus said, kind of like, look at these crazy people. Like, look at their histories. And was saying some, let's say, pretty negative things about Scottish history. And then someone on the bus said, by the way, have you ever looked at the Book of Kings recently? In other words, yes, Scottish history might have been like that, but this part of Jewish history is not the most to be proud of, put it that way. There's just a lot of war, jealousy, distrust, killing, etc. So I just wanted to put that out. That's one of the reasons I'm going to go relatively quickly through these chapters. Everyone is welcome to go back and try to make order out of all these different kings who ruled. Like I said, some of the names start between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom are almost the same, and many of the kings are referred to by 2 different names. So we're going to do our best here. So it begins in chapter 9, Elisha. He calls one of the sons of the prophets, and he sends them on a mission. And he tells him, take a flask of oil and go to remote Gilad, and there you will find among the people that you're going to meet, you're going to come across Jehu. You go to Jehu and you take him into a private room. You anoint him to be the next king, and you give him his mission. And his mission is, if we go back, one of the previous kings was Ahab. Ahab and his wife, Jezebel, they were among the worst of the worst. There was nothing but idol worship, and they killed off virtually all of the prophets. This goes back to the whole story of Eliyahu Navi when he escapes down to the Sinai to save his life. At that point, God told Eliyahu to tell Ahab that in the end, excuse me, in the end, all of his descendants would be wiped out. There would be no one left. And the same thing with Jezebel. And they would both die terrible lives, terrible deaths. And the dogs would lick up their blood from the street. They'd be left out in the street. So this son of the prophet anoints Jehu, and he tells him, God is appointing you to be the dispenser of this judgment. And so Elisha told him, as soon as you tell him this, leave. And that's what he does. And so Jehu had been sitting with a bunch of people, and they were wondering, who is this person? Why did you have to go into a room by yourself? So Jehu at first didn't want to say anything, but they could tell that something significant happened here. And so he tells them, I've just been appointed king through Elisha the prophet. And he tells him his mission. And so he's already been appointed king by the prophet, but they accept him. And they blow the shofar and declare Jehu is now the king of the northern kingdom. So, but there was another king. He was from the descendants of Ahab. And so, again, we're not going to go through every detail, but Jehu takes his men with him, and his first, call it victim, is going to be the king himself. And so he goes out, and at this point, the kings of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom are together. They had been fighting against Hazael, the king of Aram. If you remember, Elisha anointed Hazael to be king, even though it's a different country altogether. But we could see the power of the prophet. And if you remember, he cries, and he didn't anoint him, but he told him, "You're going to be king." And he said, "How can I be? I'm not a king. We have a king." And Elisha began to cry and said, and he asked him, "Why are you crying?" And he said, because I can see all of the evil that you're going to do to the Jewish people. And so Hazael went back and he murdered the king and he became king. Now the king of the northern and southern kingdom are fighting against this Hazael. And so Jehu comes looking for these kings, and they're both considered evil kings. And so the name of the king of the northern kingdom is Joram. Joram sees that Jehu is approaching him, and he sends a messenger saying, are you coming for peaceful purposes? So when he gets to Jehu, he asks in the king's name. And Jehu says, like, either you're with him or with me. You better stay with me. And he stayed. So Joram sees he didn't return, so he sends another messenger. Again, are you coming in for peace? Jehu says, I advise you to stay with me. Again, to make a long story short, finally Joram comes himself and says, are you coming for peace? And Jehu says, how can I make peace with a descendant of Ahab, who is such an evil king, who killed all of the prophets? I'm coming to dispense the judgment that was proclaimed by Eliyahu Navi about what would happen to all the descendants of Ahab. So he kills Joram, and then he kills the king of the southern kingdom as well. So they're both out of the way. And the king of the southern kingdom is brought back to Jerusalem. Ahaziah was his name, and he's buried in the city of David. And now Jehu continues on his mission. And so he is now looking for the 70 sons of Ahab. Ahab apparently had many wives. His favorite wife was Jezebel, who was introduced idol worship of the Baal to Israel, and Ahab went along with it. This is all going back to the stories of Eliyahu and Navi. And so wait one second. So now he goes to visit Jezebel. And it says that Jezebel put on makeup, adorned herself, went to the window, and she said, are you coming for peace? And he says to her, you want peace? You're talking about peace? Of all people, you're talking about peace? So he calls up, and the servants of Jezebel are there. And he says to them, you better pick sides real quickly. You're either on her side or you're on my side. And he says, if you're on my side, push her off. And that's what they did. They pushed her off. She falls to the ground and she dies. And strangely enough, Jehu says, because she's a daughter of the king, she was a daughter of the king from Lebanon, she should be buried But by the time he could arrange it, and he had forgotten the prophecy of Eliyahu Navi that she would die in the street and only the dogs would lick up her blood. And so by the time he was like getting it together to bury her, the dogs had like eaten her. There was nothing left but pools of blood. And that is how the prophecy was fulfilled. Now we find out that Ahab had 70 sons, obviously from different women. And so Jehu sends a letter to the elders of the city of Shomron. That's where these 70 sons lived. They lived more or less together. And he sent to the elders of the city, basically telling them, either you hand over all of the sons, or we come after you. And so, again, I'm not going into every detail, but they quite literally chop off the heads of all 70 of the sons of Ahab, and they bring it to Jehu literally on a platter, like the expression, right on their heads on the platter. And Jehu's response is, this is a fulfillment of God's prophecy. I am the channel, the dispenser of this judgment that was already given over by Eliyahu Navi. But Jehu didn't stop there. He went after everyone who was associated with these 70 sons, and he killed them all as well. As I said in the beginning, this is a very, very gory part of Jewish history. No doubt about it. And then he traveled and he sent the message. We can imagine that the reputation of Jehu is getting around, but apparently not totally, or the next scene probably could not have happened. So Jehu gathered people together and said, Ahab served the Baal. I will serve the Baal even more. And I want to show everyone how I am going to serve the Baal. So he ordered that all of the priests of Baal that were left, remember Eliyahu killed 450 of the priests of Baal. But here it's like a new generation, and they're still worshiping the Baal. And so Jehu says, get everyone together, all of the priests, everyone who serves Baal must come together, because we're going to, in some way, celebrate our worshiping of the Baal. And I'm going to take the lead. But of course, this was all a plot by Jehu. And so he's able to do it. They bring out the garments, they bring out all of the ritual objects, and they're all inside. And Jehu appoints 80 people. And he says to them, your job is that no one should come out alive. if anyone comes out alive, you will forfeit your life for that life that is saved. And so those 80 men went in and they slaughtered everyone that was there. And in this way, he destroyed the worship of Baal. But then, we're in the 10th chapter, it says the most amazing thing. So you would think, in a certain way, it's hard to have like a very positive picture of Jehu. On the other hand, he received a prophecy from both Eliyahu and Elisha that this is what he was supposed to do in the name of God. And so here, I have to interject, because if one is reading these stories, not just these stories, but I'll just concentrate on these stories, and I'm reading them in English and don't have any oral tradition, it's hard to imagine what we think of God. God is ordering all of this mass slaughter that's going on. So how do we understand this? So this is something that we've discussed before. This is an extreme case. But when Eliyahu first pronounced this prophecy to Ahab, he told him, there'll be nothing left of you. Nothing. And the same thing with Jezebel. This is what's called the consequences of one's action. We've talked about Middah, Keneged Middah, and a measure for a measure, many, many times. And that so many times in the Torah where it states that God is doing this, or God is demanding this, or God is instructing certain things, that if we look at it just from a different perspective, is this is the consequences of one's actions. Probably maybe the most important, because it's the first, is in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, when after they ate from the tree, then God pronounces a string of curses for the snake, for Eve, and for Adam. But when you look very, very closely at the whole story, it becomes clear that these curses are the consequences of their action. It's Middah Keneged Middah. It's a measure for measure. For every action in this world, there's an equal and opposite occurrence. Zeh lumat zeh aseh Elokim. This against this God has made. But so many times it's as if God is doing it. And so we have to just see the subtle difference here, especially when you read stories like this. It's hard to get our head around God giving Jehu all of these instructions and not applying this idea of a measure for measure, and that things are playing themselves out according to what people have brought down upon themselves. So right after Jehu has done everything we just described, and it says he got rid of the worship of Baal, then it says that Jehu did not follow did not follow God. Oh, wait, excuse me. First it says that after this, what he didn't do was, if you remember, the first king of the northern kingdom, Joram, he set up 2 golden calves, one in Bethel and one in Dan. And that became the beginning of the idol worship of the northern kingdom. And then when Ahab and Jezebel introduced the Baal, then that became the main idol worship. So it says that maybe he destroyed the Baal, but he left these golden calves. And then it says God came to him and said, "You have done well in executing what is right in my eyes, and you have cleansed the northern kingdom of any trace of Ahab." And he told him, "Your sons to the 4th generation, they will be the kings of the northern kingdom." But then it says that Jehu turned against God, turned against the Torah, did not follow the Torah, and he followed the ways of Jeroboam, who planted this evil in the northern kingdom, which just continued generation after generation. So this is like astounding that after he does what God says, including getting rid of the Baal, the idol worship of the Baal, he turns out to be no better than any of the other ones. So this is really quite perplexing. Now we start chapter 11. I mentioned that when Jehu first started, the first thing he did, he killed the king of the northern kingdom, Joram, and Ahaziah, who was the king of the southern kingdom. He also was not considered a good king, even though many, if not most, of the kings of the southern kingdom of Yehuda, they were righteous, but not all of them. And we're going to see more that are righteous and more that are not righteous. Right now, of the northern kingdom, there has not been one righteous king from the beginning. And so the mother of Ahaziah, her name was Athaliah. Now, here again is just more blood and gore. She is the mother of the king. The king is now dead. So what does she do? She kills all of her grandchildren so she can rule. It's difficult to understand all of this and to read it and to learn about it. But one of the daughters, her name was Yehosheva. She was actually the daughter of Joram and the sister of Ahaziah. It wasn't the daughter of the king, it was the sister of the king. She was able to save one of the sons, Joash, and she hid him. She hid him for 6 years. Somehow she pulled this off, and now Athaliah, she is ruling Israel. She had done her best to kill off her family. It's quite incredible. And she kept him alive for 6 years. His name was Joash. In the 7th year, Jehoiada, That was his name. He's not the same Yehoiada of the time of King David. This is many generations later. Anyways, he took it upon himself that this Joash would become king because he was the son of the previous king. And so he gathered many, many, many people with instructions of how to protect this young child. And he set up a whole system of taking turns and guarding every place where something terrible could happen to this young child. And then he takes his child, and by the altar in the temple, he crowns him the next king. And all the people that Jehoiada had gathered, so it says they all clapped their hands, and they said, "Long live the king." So this may be one of the sources of this term that's used in nations around the world. Long live the king. So this is Joash. But when Athaliah found out about this, and she sees that her grandson actually had just been made king, so she cries, "Treason, treason." But Jehoiada commands that she be killed, and that is what happened to her. And at that point, the people of, this is the southern kingdom of Yehuda. So the people were all excited that there was a new king. He was young, but they took it upon themselves that they would serve God, and they would make sure all the worship of Baal was taken down and all of their altars were destroyed. And so it said he sat on the throne, and all the people rejoiced, and the city was quiet again. The city was quiet. And it says that he was actually only 7 years old. Remember, they hid him for 6 years. In the 7th year, he was made king. Remember, Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, was 12 years old. Here he's even younger. And he reigned for 40 years in Jerusalem, and he was a righteous king. He led Israel, keeping the Torah, connected to God. And at one point, he sees that the temple is it's like a little bit decrepit. And so he orders that money be collected and they should do the repairs on the temple. And so that's what they do. And it makes clear that the money went to the workers. It went to the workers because they were working so hard, and the money for that which they were making came from a different treasury. but they made sure to be righteous and pay everyone for the work that they were doing. And it makes also the point that everything was done on an honor system. Like they didn't check in and out of work, and everyone was honest about what they had done, and they got honest pay for it. Now we come back to Hazael of Aram. Again, he's the one that Elisha cried because of all the evil that he was going to do to Israel. So here, I just have to interject. This is also, it's a mystery that if Hazael was going to do so much evil, why did God send Elisha to inform him that he would become king? If he wouldn't have informed him he would become king, Hazael never would have had the guts to kill the previous king. It was only when Elisha told him, "You're meant to be king," that he became king. So these are mysteries that we don't understand. It's very, very similar to what happened with Jonah, the prophet Jonah, where God wanted him to go to the city of Nineveh and tell them it would be overturned. And Jonah was afraid that they were going to do tshuva, and that God, who is a merciful God, would accept their tshuva. But he didn't want to do it because he was a prophet. He saw the same country would shortly afterwards, this was Assyria, Nineveh was in Assyria, would take the 12 tribes, the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom into exile forever. And Jonah could not get his head around, like, how can I be the prophet to be the channel through which they're going to end up doing tshuva? These are mysteries that are really beyond us, but there's no doubt that there is an aspect of Middah Keneged Middah, a measure for measure, because the northern kingdom, from the time it was set up with Yerovam, was just full of idol worship. They turned away from God. They didn't even treat each other well. Many of the prophets came and castigated them for not setting up a just society. Even if they were worshiping idols, they could have been nice to their neighbor. But in all moral and ethical levels, they had totally fallen. And so somehow, again, they brought it down upon themselves. But nonetheless, the way the text is, that it's as if God is doing it all. Now, God is doing it all, but we have free choice. And we set up this idea of a measure for measure. So here, Hazael is now attacking the southern kingdom, and he's coming against Jerusalem. And so it says that Joash had really felt he had no choice. He had to pay ransom. He took all the gold and silver and treasures of the kingdom, and he kind of bought off Hazael, who took it, and he did leave, and he left. And then Joash passes away. And Jehu has now passed away in the northern kingdom, and his son Yochaz began to reign in Shomron. And again, another evil king. And so it says that the anger of God burned against Israel. Now we're talking about generations now, one after the other, of not following God, not following the Torah, and not following setting up a just society at the very least. Nonetheless, this king of the northern kingdom cries out to God, and God saves a remnant of the northern kingdom. And then more evil kings in the northern kingdom. Joash, who ruled for 40 years and was a good king, so he finally passes away. Now we come to something very significant. We're going to end the story of Elisha. Elisha is now sick, and the text says he's going to die from this sickness. And so Joash comes and he cries over Elisha. And he says, very similar to what Elisha said that when he sees Eliyahu being taken away. He says, Avi, Avi, Rechav Yisrael Parshav. He says, my father, the chariot of Israel and all of its horsemen. So Elisha says to him, take a bow and arrows. And he took him to the window and he said, pull the arrow back and put the bow back and put an arrow in it. And Elisha put his hands on the king's hands. And he said, open the window to the east. And he said, shoot. And they shot this arrow. And then he said, this is the arrow of deliverance from Aram. And this is Hazael of Aram, who has been persecuting the northern and southern kingdoms. And he said to him that this arrow is the arrow of deliverance. And you will be able to smite him and be able to defeat them. And he said to him, take the arrows. And he said, hit them on the ground. Take the arrows and hit them on the ground. And so the king did it 3 times, and he stopped. And Elisha said, ay, chaval, chaval. Why did you stop after hitting 3 times? If you would have hit 5 or 6 times, you would have been able to completely consume them, and they would never have bothered you again. So this is a very common thing among the prophets. Here, it doesn't say that God commanded him to do this, but for those of you who have my book on prophecy and divine inspiration, there's a whole chapter about when God commands different prophets to do symbolic acts. And there's a whole string of them. This is not the format to go into them. But Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, and others were commanded to do symbolic acts. Some of them we take quite literally that they did them. Others are symbolic, and it seems that they were not done in a physical manner, but they were done in, like, I'll call it a mental vision of the prophet. So this is just one of the cases, but Elisha is in a sense doing this on his own. It could have been that he had a prophecy from God to do this with the king, but it doesn't say that. And so here I'm just pointing out that this happens many, many times where the prophet almost always at God's instruction does some symbolic act. So the question is, what is the purpose of these acts? And in short, we could just say that through these symbolic acts, it helps or assists bringing a certain energy into reality. That just like almost all of the mitzvot entail a physical action or a physical object or speech, that we don't just kind of mentally do mitzvot. There's 6 particular that are called the perpetual mitzvot, but virtually all the mitzvot are done in a physical manner. And so it's the same thing with these signs, that there was this energy that needed to be brought down in the world, that the king of Israel could defeat the king of Aram. And so Elisha is performing this symbolic act in order to help make it real. In a certain way, it's not exactly, but in modern quantum physics, the idea of the observer affects the reality of what is being observed. It's not a passive observation. An observer affects that which is being observed. So here, it's not exactly the same, but it's similar, that performing these certain acts, and we have this throughout Jewish tradition, where we do certain things in order to manifest a certain reality. The one that comes to my mind immediately is shaking lulav. And with all of the mystical meanings of shaking lulav, the simple, almost literal understanding is to draw rain into the world. We're shaking lulav during Sukkot. We're at the end of 6 dry months in Israel. Not a drop of rain. And Israel needs rain. People need water to survive. And so Sukkot is the transition between summer and the rainy months. And shaking lulav is we'll call it a symbolic act in order, along with our kavanah, of course, with our intention of drawing rain into the world. But this happens in many, many different ways. And then Elisha dies. And it says that they buried him. And then a different enemy comes against Israel, Moab. And so Moab is attacking, and it's in the middle of battles, and someone dies. And the people, like, just, they don't know how to bury this person. And they happen to be right near where Elisha is buried. And so they just open the grave and they put this person in the grave. And lo and behold, what happens as soon as this man, it was a corpse, touches the body of Elisha, he comes back to life. So this is actually a second time that Elisha, he's dead, but nonetheless, just touching his body caused the other person to come back to life. Now, obviously, this is a totally miraculous kind of event. And then it says that, again, Hazael of Aram is wreaking havoc in Israel. And it says that God was gracious to them, even though there are so many of them are evil and not following God. But God says, for the sake of Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, I can't allow them to be totally destroyed. And he's able to push Hazael out of Israel. Okay, now we're on chapter 14. That is as far as we're going to go tonight. And here again, more evil kings, one after the other. And so here, what I didn't mention before is Joash. He was the one who became king at 7 years old. He ruled for 40 years. He was considered a very righteous king. His servants, it doesn't tell why, and I have to be honest, I didn't have a chance to look at the commentaries, but they killed the king, and his son takes over. His name is Ahaziah, and what he did is he found out who had killed his father, and he had them all killed. And then it says an interesting thing. It says, but the children of the servants who had slain his father, he didn't lay a hand. And he quotes from the Torah, which says that fathers should not be put to death for their children, and children should not be put to death for their fathers. In other words, each person has to take responsibility for their own, and you don't punish children because of what the fathers did, or fathers for what the children did. So it's interesting that in the midst of all of this killing that is going on, really generation after generation, that this is inserted in the book of Kings. And then Ahaziah, the king of the southern kingdom, sends word to Jehoash the king of the northern kingdom, saying, let's look upon one another. In other words, let's get together. Maybe we have something to discuss. Nonetheless, Jehoash, the king of the southern kingdom, is very suspicious. And nonetheless, they got together in Beit Shemesh, which is in Yehuda. And the next verse says that Yehuda was defeated in this place. In other words, for some reason, they were at each other's throats again. And we saw an interesting thing is that, again, we've been going through generations here. A sustained amount of time has gone by here. Sometimes the kings of the northern kingdom and southern kingdom get together to fight common enemies, and sometimes they fight against each other. And it almost kind of never know which way it's going to go. And the king of the northern kingdom, so that he goes to Jerusalem and he raids all the gold and the silver and all the vessels from the temple, and he took hostages and he returned to the Shomron. So this wasn't just like a little battle here. And then he dies, this king of the northern kingdom. And it just continues. Just the son of each of the kings rules. Most of the time they are killed by their own people. And again, God saw that the way things were going, there would be nothing left of Israel. They were just either their enemies were little by little destroying them, or each other, the north and south kingdoms were fighting against each other. And again, it says he had compassion upon them in order that a remnant would always remain. And with this, we end the 14th chapter. There's approximately 9 more chapters in the book of Kings. And in another chapter or 2, we're going to get into very, very important stories. Today, we went through many, many chapters fairly quickly. But what is ahead of us is the whole story of how the 10 tribes were eventually taken away into exile, how Jerusalem almost fell to Assyria, and a number of very good kings, especially Hezekiah and Isaiah is introduced into the story here. And it goes all the way to basically Nebuchadnezzar laying siege and destroying the temple. So those are the approximately 9 or 10 chapters left in the book of Kings.